Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's Kirby Institute seminar series presentation. My name is Ben Babington. I'm part of the HIV Epidemiology and Prevention program here at the Kirby and also the chair of the Kirby Institute seminar series. So of course, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather today, all the various lands, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So in my case, this is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Feel free to write yours in the chat if you'd like to. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. So just some housekeeping to start off with. The format for the seminar will be that we'll start off with a presentation, followed by hopefully about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. You can ask questions throughout the seminar by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and just typing your questions in. So please feel free to do that during the presentation. You don't have to wait till the end. It's actually always helpful for us to have a couple of questions that are there waiting for us as soon as the speaker is finished so that we can get going immediately without me having to invent a couple of questions. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Curtis Chan, who is a PhD student and project officer in the HIV Epidemiology and Prevention program at the Kirby Institute. So his work focuses on HIV prevention in gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, including studies on PrEP awareness, PrEP uptake, PrEP knowledge, and HIV and STI testing. And he currently works on the gay community periodic surveys and a range of other projects, chiefly around PrEP. So Curtis has become something of an expert in our group on event-driven PrEP. He's done a few papers and various analyses on this topic, and that's what he's going to be speaking to about to us today. So please welcome Curtis. Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
So hi, everyone. So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I'm speaking from Bidjigal land. So like Ben said, I'm a PhD student and a project officer here at Kirby in the HIV and Epidemiology and Prevention program. And I've become really interested in PrEP for a lot of reasons, and specifically event-driven PrEP. So what we mean by event-driven PrEP here, some people call it on-demand, some people call it event-based dosing, 2-on-1. For the purposes of this presentation, they all mean the same thing, taking PrEP around the time of sex. And I think it's really interesting for a lot of reasons, mostly because in Australia, when we think of PrEP, we still think of the daily pill. So I'll be presenting some data that we've been collecting about event-driven PrEP and posing some questions about what that means for the future of PrEP in Australia. But before we get into that, I kind of want to do a bit of a background of what we know about event-driven PrEP. And even before that, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the origins of PrEP. So this was well before my time, but the previous studies found that PrEP as a combination of TDF-FTC was very effective at preventing HIV infection in men who have sex with men, shown in the trials in the early 2010s. So I just want to set up from these original studies that PrEP was found to be highly effective even at 4 pills a week. So you can see in this graph, there's an estimated HIV incidence based on the amount of drug concentration in the body. And the pink bar is the amount of drug concentration, but the IQR of people who take 4 pills a week. So a lot of people will kind of mention among men with sex with men, the forgiveness of PrEP is pretty good with about 4 pills a week. And this is where that kind of comes from. I'm not a pharmacologist, so I apologize if I screwed that up, but that's how we've understood it. And so, the general advice is that missing 1 or 2 pills a week you're still quite protected from HIV infection when taking PrEP. But even before the studies were published, there was some work done with monkeys that were showing how intermittent PrEP, so not quite event-driven yet, but not taking PrEP every day, could potentially work as a way of preventing HIV infection. So you can see in the graph on the left, the intermittent monkeys that were infected with SHIV, if they were given pills, if they were given a dose of TDF-FTC before and after, they were found to be just as protected as those who were taking it daily. And then if in a future study also in monkeys, they found that actually increased when you give them a double dose. So that when the first loading dose was given 24 hours before, and I've been told that this double dose is kind of standard practice or a very typical way of getting drug concentration really quickly in the body before an exposure. So I just wanted to lay out this as the groundwork to set up how the human trials for event-driven PrEP around the time of exposure was kind of justified. So anyone who knows about on-demand PrEP or event-driven PrEP will know about the study, and this is the Epidemiology trial that was first published in 2015, led by Jean-Michel Molina. And I think this study is considered as that first one that established ED-PrEP as an effective method of preventing HIV infection. So participants were instructed to take 2 pills 2 to 24 hours before sex, and then a pill for the following 2 days, and that was found to be highly effective. So this is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but there's since been some follow-up studies, including sub-studies of the gay participants that found biological plausibility to show that this double dose was detectable in rectal tissue soon after the dose, and found that drug concentrations of the body was consistent with what you'd think of as being highly protected from HIV infection. I'm going to note here, it's really, really important to note that event-driven PrEP is not recommended for those who are recorded female at birth, as more pills are required per week to get the drug concentration necessary to protect yourself from HIV in the female genital tract compared to the rectal tissue. So after a few years, this study was first published in 2015. After a few years, the WHO introduced this 2-on-1 method of taking PrEP into their clinical guidelines and released a technical report on how to take it in 2019. So here's an example of how to take 2-on-1. So if this cis man was anticipating a sexual risk exposure at Friday at 10 p.m., he would need to take the loading dose by 8 p.m. at the latest. Then he'd take a pill again on Saturday and finish on Sunday. So here's a similar situation, but this cis man has another sexual exposure on Saturday. He would take a pill again on Saturday, but also would also need to take another pill Sunday and Monday. So you just take 2 pills after your last sexual exposure. Similar again, you could probably anticipate what's going to happen next. You're going to need to have another dose on Tuesday. So even if we conceptualize it as event-driven around the time of PrEP, the 2-on-1 can extend for a little bit longer than just a single event. So why should we care about event-driven PrEP? Well, many people could really benefit from PrEP who may not necessarily want to take daily pills, particularly people who find daily adherence a bit difficult. There are a lot of those who don't have a lot of sexual exposure and who would find daily PrEP not worth it. So that's a common thing that we hear, that having PrEP every day just doesn't make sense from a cost side of things for people who aren't having a lot of sex. And practically speaking, taking fewer pills has the advantage of being cheaper in the long run. So people who don't, again, where cost is a really significant factor, this is a way that potentially you could remain protected while not necessarily needing to take PrEP every day. But there are some challenges with using ED-PrEP, and I will get into a little bit more of this later in the presentation, but I'll mention it here now as well. Firstly, many people can't really plan when they're going to have sex, and to take ED-PrEP, as per the guidelines, you need to have at least 2 hours notice or be able to delay sex for 2 hours. While I mentioned the issues with daily adherence as a potential attractive factor for event-driven PrEP, you have to remember that event-driven PrEP has a minimum of 4 pills. That means that missing 1, 2 of those doses has a really significant impact on how protected you are from HIV. So there is less forgiveness when taking event-driven PrEP. And there's still really not a lot of knowledge out there, and I'll get back to that. But to be able to take event-driven PrEP well, it really relies on you knowing how to take it. And daily PrEP is much more easy to understand in comparison. Just take a pill every day. And like I said before, it's not recommended for those who are assigned female at birth. But I just really wanted to note that here, daily PrEP isn't for everyone, and having more choice is good. And that's kind of the crux of the pros and cons and why we should care about a different dosing regimen. So this sets a scene of ED-PrEP from a bit of a theoretical standpoint, but let's kind of take a look at global event-driven PrEP uptake. That first study was published in 2015. Has much changed since then? I put this slide in to remind us that in Australia, we are really fortunate that we've had PrEP for quite a while, but in a lot of places in the world, that's not the case. And even places where there's a bit of PrEP, there might not be kind of widespread implementation. We have it publicly funded here. And discussions about event-driven PrEP globally might be secondary to just PrEP implementation generally. So just keep that in mind with a little bit of the studies I'm going to review in a second. So I'm going to have a very special spotlight on Europe because that's where it all started. So IPIGAY started in France, and soon after that study was published in 2015, it was actually adopted quite quickly by the European AIDS Clinical Society in their guidelines. And from what I can tell, it seems that Eventurin PrEP is quite a popular regimen among people in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And they were very early adopters of Eventurin PrEP, and it's quite an established method there. As far as I could tell, I couldn't find a lot of evidence in other parts of Europe. I'm sure it's out there. And I did see a little bit of evidence in Germany. But if you have more information, let me know. I'd be really curious to see where else. But I couldn't find anything on my research. I'm lumping everyone else into this one slide. There is a lot more out there, but I kind of had, again, a special mention of Europe because there's more in Europe, but a little bit more of a smattering in other parts of the world. It isn't to say that ePrEP isn't relevant elsewhere, but a lot of places, again, haven't had PrEP implementation, and even if they have, they might not have incorporated Eventurin PrEP. I'll mention that several studies in Asia, particularly mainland China, found ePrEP hypothetically a really popular dosing regimen. In Taiwan, I believe ED-PrEP is actually formally recommended in their PrEP guidelines. And I found a recent publication from Hong Kong that they did an RCT comparing ED-PrEP and daily PrEP's effectiveness, and finding them to be equally as effective, which is very good. I also want to note that other countries in that region have started using Eventurin PrEP, to my knowledge, particularly Thailand and Vietnam. So something interesting, when we were publishing some stuff about Eventurin PrEP, I was kind of alerted to a publication about a multinational West African study, and found about 3/4 of that study I chose to use ED-PrEP. What is concerning, however, is that in that study, those who reported on-demand PrEP, Eventurin PrEP, reported significantly lower overall adherence. And there are a lot of complications with that, and I will talk about that later on in the presentation, but that is something concerning that we should keep an eye on. I'm going to say a lot of North American studies looking at Eventurin PrEP, people who use it, the characteristics of people who use it, preferences and so on. I couldn't fit it all into one slide. It's out there, you can find it. I don't mean to dismiss it. It's just I think there's a lot of interesting work elsewhere and in Australia, and I'm going to bring that in soon. I just want to know, I couldn't find a lot of other evidence elsewhere. I'm sure I've missed something. I recently saw just the other day that I was doing a kind of last minute check, and there was some evidence that people in Brazil, for example, preferred daily over Eventurin, but that was from older data from what I can tell. All right, that's the rest of the world. What about Australia? So again, taking a step back a little bit, I wanted to just mention some of the PrEP studies that have started in Australia and kind of the timeline of PrEP here. So we had Prelude that started in 2014 and ended in 2016, and Epic, New South Wales started in 2016 and in 2018. So PrEP-X, so the Victorians and the South Australians, and also Q-PrEP in Queensland started in 2017, ended soon after the PBS listing. And 2018, big year for PrEP, publicly funded, publicly subsidized, but importantly, in 2019, Eventurin PrEP was formally introduced into the ASHM PrEP prescribing guidelines. So in 2021, we had some social marketing campaigns run by Emanate and ACON and NEHIV, and these campaigns ran to kind of upskill people about a general PrEP awareness, but also was the first social marketing campaign, to my knowledge, that really introduced these different ways or different dosing regimens of taking PrEP. So you can see here, we've got daily, on demand, and periodic, which is taking PrEP for a discrete amount of time. I'm taking it daily, for example, for a month. So that's the kind of the context. So now I'm actually going to review some data, some stuff that we've published, some stuff is more of a synthesis of other existing literature. The four main areas that I'm going to be presenting data on is awareness of event-driven PrEP, so how many people actually know about it. Interest, so how many people would want to use ED PrEP and would prefer it over other types of PrEP. Use, so not hypothetical use, like actually how many people have been using this regimen. And knowledge, do they know how to use it correctly? So here are a couple studies. The first was published in 2019 by Vincent Cornelise from mostly the PrEP-X participants in 2018. And they found that about a third of them had some prior knowledge of event-driven PrEP. So in a sample of previous EPIC New South Wales participants, so the PrEP in New South Wales transition study, which is a data set that I've been publishing a lot out of, we found that about 2/3 of them knew about event-driven PrEP, and this was conducted at the end of 2019 and the start of 2020. So soon after the ASHM guidelines were updated to include event-driven PrEP. We conducted a survey about after the social marketing campaigns about kind of awareness of the campaigns and PrEP knowledge. And while that's in very preliminary analysis, still unpublished, we found that among the cis gay and bisexual men, or cis GBM, who had heard of PrEP, about 2/3 of those had heard of event-driven PrEP. So I think it's quite interesting that in just a year's time, a general sample has very similar awareness to the really early adopters of PrEP. So yeah. So moving on to interest, there are actually quite a lot of studies internationally, not just in Australia, that have looked at preferences for PrEP, not just daily versus event-driven, but also for the hypothetical modes of PrEP that are emerging. So we're talking about the long-acting injection, CAB-LA, implants, monthly pills, and so on. But in most of those studies will also include event-driven PrEP, and have noted, and I'll note internationally, it is a kind of a consistent minority, but still substantial. And I think that Australia is no exception. So in the Prelude study, that we found that 14% said that they would prefer event-driven PrEP over daily and other oral regimens. And in that same paper by Vincent Cornelise, in the largely PrEP-X participants in Victoria, about half reported interest in participating in an ED PrEP trial. So that was before the ASHM guidelines. I'm going to present some data that we've collected, and also we've been given, that's been collected after the ED PrEP guidelines. So that will be the PrEP in New South Wales transition study. So that was from those EPIC New South Wales participants, and also from the PREPARE project that is conducted down at the Centre for Social Research and Health, led by Martin Holt, and a lot of these analyses were provided to me by James McGibbon. So in the PrEP in New South Wales transition study, we asked these previous participants what about their preferences for current and future PrEP modalities. So again, survey was conducted at the end of 2019, start of 2020. And we asked them that if these modes were equally as effective, which would you take? So we didn't phrase it as willingness, but if they were available, what would you use? And the graph on the left are not mutually exclusive. They could tick multiple options, but the graph on the right, they had to pick their most preferred of the options. And you can see that a lot of people, remembering that these are really highly experienced PrEP users, a sizable number of them would prefer event-driven PrEP. And I think it's interesting that even though a lot of them were on PrEP and taking it daily, that they were reporting interest and preference, but not actually taking it event-driven at the time. I'll also note that there is a lot of interest for these other PrEP modalities, the long-acting injection and the implant. But I still think it is really interesting that the event-driven still remains at about a fifth of the top preference. So like I said, this is some unpublished data from the PREPARE project that was very kindly given to me. And I think that the studies were very interesting. So first thing that you may notice, the new blue area is they on top of the modalities that we had in our study, they've also included the monthly pill. By the way, these data may not be published yet, but they will be published very, very soon, I've been told. So not only do they include this monthly pill, but remember that this sample is of general gay bisexual men. So not just these early adopters of PrEP. And I think it's really interesting. Again, it's about a fifth say that they would prefer event-driven PrEP as the top PrEP modality. But what I thought was particularly interesting was that if you split these by PrEP users and non-PrEP users, you'll find that non-PrEP users much prefer event-driven PrEP more than the current users. And that could be for a lot of reasons. The PrEP users might be very used to daily PrEP and they just don't think that they need to switch over to event-driven PrEP. It works for them. People who aren't taking PrEP at the moment probably didn't like the idea of daily PrEP to begin with, and that's why they didn't initiate it. But maybe the idea of taking pills around the time of sex would suit their needs more, and that's why they might prefer it. A lot of reasons, a lot of potential reasons why they prefer it. But if you can get anything out of the studies that I just presented, is that even if it's not always the most popular option, it is still seems to be a really good option for a lot of people, or they think it's going to be a good option for them. And I believe anecdotally around the world, places that introduced PrEP implementation with both daily and event-driven at the same time found that a lot of them would prefer event-driven PrEP over daily. But the reverse isn't true. If you had started with daily PrEP, a lot of people aren't as keen on switching to a different dosing regimen once they're used to it. I'm sure people have a lot of thoughts on that. Please let me know in the chat if you have any other insights into that. So now moving on to use, here's just a couple of studies run by the Kirby and the CSRH that I've included. And in the gay community periodic surveys in 2019, when we first started asking about if you're taking PrEP, how are you taking it? We found that use was quite low, depending on the jurisdiction. It was at about 5 to 8% in 2019. But by 2020, nearly a fifth of those in the GCPS nationally reported event-driven PrEP use. And this is very much echoed in these other studies that I'm mentioning here, where about 2019, very low, but then by 2020, 2021, a lot more people had heard about it. It was in the guidelines for longer, and people were starting to use it a lot more. So Garrett Pressage, also at the Kirby, also with us at the HIV Epidemiology Prevention Program, kindly let me use one of his slides that he presented at the ASHM conference last year. So this is using flux data following lives undergoing change, and it is tracking the intention to use on-demand PrEP during the COVID lockdown. So during that time, a lot more people were, more and more likely to want to switch to event-driven PrEP. And if taken together from the last slide about use, you'll see that the GCPS and flux kind of point towards a COVID effect. So it makes sense. In a time where people are having less sex, moving to a PrEP regimen that requires fewer pills is probably a really good option for a lot of people. All right, so here is something that I'm really, really curious about, and it's about knowledge. So, people are starting to use it a lot more from those last couple of slides, but do they know how to take it? So to assess this, we, in the PrEP in New South Wales transition study, and also in this PrEP campaign survey that we recently ran, we asked these 3 questions. So how many pills need to be taken before sex? When should the first dose be taken? And how many days after should you take 1 pill per day? So the correct answers are bolded. Hopefully you got those right. But we looked at how many people knew these answers, and you'll also note that in these 3 questions, there is an I don't know potential option. So you don't have to guess. If you don't know, you can just tell us. So what I thought was really interesting is that when we restrict the sample of these really early adopters of PrEP to those who were aware of event-driven PrEP, only an eighth knew how to do the 2-1-1 method correctly. And that's in a publication that is available online first in JADES. So, check that out. But you'll also see that, about a third say that they just didn't know to all 3. And I think that is, quite interesting and, potentially quite concerning that people don't know how to take it. could be a lot of reasons why. If you have no intention of using event-driven PrEP, you don't need to know how to take it. And in fact, the sample, very few people wanted to use it or were currently using it. And if we break these down into the composite questions, where green is the correct answer and black is I don't know, you'll see that most were more likely to know or potentially guess that the loading dose was 2 pills, but less likely to know when the first dose needed to be taken and how many days after do you need to take pills. It is also important that in the 2 right graphs about how many pills to, how many days after to take pills and the timing, people were, a lot of people were incorrect, but incorrect in a safe direction. So, about 21% said that you needed to take pills for 3 days afterwards, and that's still, highly protected. And, also for those who take pills more than 24 hours in advance, there's still likely to have a lot of protection there. So it's not at all a bad news story. But what I think is, again, really interesting is that with this PrEP campaign survey that we ran with the general sample, much smaller in comparison, but a lot of them knew how to take it correctly. So, a little bit under half knew how to take it, and a lot fewer, less than a quarter said that they didn't know at all. So, before in that previous study, people didn't know and they just weren't even going to guess. And they had not enough knowledge to kind of guess one of those potential options. But more and more people know about this regimen. And breaking it down again to those composite questions, really good news story. I think the biggest challenge is going to be that loading dose. Again, a lot of people who were incorrect in the days after to take pills were incorrect in a safe direction. But that loading dose is extremely important. Those monkey studies showed that that for event-driven PrEP to work, both a pre-exposure dose and a post-exposure dose is necessary. And the timing of it is really important. So the 2 to 20 to at least 2 hours is really critical. So I've just kind of blown through that data. And just to quickly summarize, there was a lot more awareness and interest in event-driven PrEP and from 2019 to now. And so that could be a lot of things. The impact of the ASHM guidelines, now that it's been introduced, people might be more confident in using it. The impact of the social marketing campaigns, those ads. Anecdotally, I've heard that from clinicians, they might be initiating conversations about event-driven PrEP, particularly in sexual health clinics. And we're seeing that a lot of people are using it more. It for a lot of reasons, potentially, again, more awareness, but also maybe less frequent sex during and after the COVID lockdowns. But I think a continuing challenge with event-driven PrEP is being able to educate people and get more people knowing how to take it in a way that keeps them highly protected from HIV. So that is data, but this is where I want everyone here who is interested to kind of really engage with me in this, because I have a lot of thoughts about event-driven PrEP and the future of it, and as well as PrEP in general, that I suspect a lot of people here have really good thoughts and opinions on. So I'm curious to see. So please engage in the chat. One thing that I didn't present on at all, any data that we presented on, was a key stakeholder are the clinicians. So all of that about event-driven PrEP preferences use is from the end user, but the clinicians are an important stakeholder. They're the ones who might initiate or encourage or even discourage event-driven PrEP use. So Anthony Smith down at the Center for Social Research and Health published a study where looking exactly at that. And take a look at this quote. I discourage people from using it that way, generally speaking. My preferred dosing mechanism is to take it every day. The sort of on and off, on-demand PrEP, I just find it confusing, and for me too. It's difficult to expect someone to be able to realistically do that. And that was a quote from a GP in Anthony's study. So I think that is a continuing challenge to get not just the end users to know, but also the potential prescribers. But I think that there is potential there. So it might be a matter of training and upskilling. So this is from a research letter by Melissa Power at the Western Sydney Sexual Health Centre. So healthcare workers stated several barriers to discussing on-demand PrEP, including uncertainty about the current ASHM draft guidelines. So this was conducted around 2019. Feeling that the on-demand PrEP schedule is confusing. Most healthcare workers, 88%, 15 of 17, suggested that they would like more training about on-demand PrEP. So we need to involve clinicians in kind of this upskilling and education as well if event-driven PrEP is going to increase in uptake. One thing that I actually didn't know before doing this presentation was that currently nowhere in the world has pharmaceutical approval for event-driven PrEP as a dosing regimen. So in Australia, a body like the TGA would be handling something like that. And it's just daily. And realistically, there's not an incentive to push for event-driven PrEP as a separate listing in kind of the drug listing prescribing guidelines. That's because the drug companies probably don't want to push a regimen where you take fewer pills than daily. But also there's not a big need from their perspective because clinicians can prescribe it differently to what's on the box in a discretionary way. But there are some implications of this. So, it's not on packaging, it's on the labels. If you pick up a bottle at a glance, you wouldn't be able to know how to take event-driven PrEP correctly. And having sometimes, you just want like an official little box official text on your box to tell you how to take it. And in a more indirect way, maybe this not being on kind of the official drug listings might promote some of that hesitance of the clinicians that we saw in those earlier quotes. And coming back to some of the things I mentioned earlier about the challenges with event-driven PrEP is that it has more components than daily. Daily is a very straightforward regimen. Just take a pill every day. Recently the ASHM guidelines have also changed to be in line with event-driven PrEP. You no longer need, the week or 2 week lead up. You can just start daily PrEP with the same way that you would start on demand. But like we saw in those previous quotes from those clinicians, some people might find, the loading dose confusing, remembering how many pills you need to take before and after. So a really important challenge that we're going to have to confront is clear messaging on how to take the 2-on-1, particularly for people for whom English is not their first language and potentially could really benefit from event-driven PrEP, given that the costs of PrEP would be high for those who aren't Medicare eligible. And I'm going to get back to this point about the lower forgiveness stuff. I have an important point on this, but just to say that, the decision tree or the decision making about what to do when you miss a dose on event-driven PrEP, to my knowledge, is not super clear. And that was something that I think needs a lot more work on. If we see more people taking it, more people will be taking it incorrectly, given that a lot of people don't know how to take it in the first place. So this point, connection to care, daily PrEP is really, really convenient because a prescription that gets you 3 months of pills, if you take it daily and you run out of pills, that's a really great opportunity for you to come back to clinics to get your HIV and STI testing done. You lose that with event-driven PrEP. Not necessarily, they're not mutually exclusive. You can take event-driven PrEP and still have your quarterly testing, but for some people, having that pill, the depletion of your pills as a prompt to go for HIV testing is lost and is something that we should also keep an eye on. So this is the last point is a bit more of a long-term problem. It's pretty theoretical, but other infections have developed drug resistance due to a population not being adherent to it. If event-driven PrEP is taken incorrectly, if PrEP in general is taken incorrectly by a large population for a long period of time, there is a chance that PrEP-resistant HIV could emerge. Not saying that that's an immediate concern. To my knowledge, it's not. But yeah, just something to keep in mind. So I'm going to go back to this slide just to show some fringe cases. There are a lot more fringe cases or weird scenarios to think of, but let's go back to this person, hey? So they have an exposure on Friday, their last dose is on Sunday. They have another exposure on Tuesday, in a couple of days' time. So they finished their last dose on Sunday, it's been 2 days. Do they need another loading dose? I think conventional wisdom or current, my understanding is that yes, you would recommend for them to take a new loading dose, but in reality, this scenario is essentially a week of daily PrEP. You're taking, you nearly have a whole week from Friday to Thursday of pills. And we know that there's forgiveness by missing a pill, missing 1 or 2 pills a week. So as an end user, you might think, oh, I probably don't need to do another 2 pills, even because I just finished one a couple of days ago. That isn't to say that that's what we should recommend, but again, my knowledge, I don't think there's a clear guideline on these situations, and the reality is people just might do whatever they think makes sense to them. But whether or not you need clear guidance is, in some kind of framework is, an open conversation, I think. So here is another example. So what happens if you miss your pill, your second post-exposure dose? So you could go on the 28-day course of post-exposure prophylaxis, but many people don't want to do that for a lot of reasons. Side effects and not having to take a daily pill all the time. But even if they did, they have a very short window from missing their PrEP to starting PEP. So when the current guideline suggests that for PEP to be initiated, it has to be done within the 72 hours of exposure. So if you miss your pill on Sunday, you really have Monday to start PEP. But maybe some people will just take the missed pill. Maybe that will be fine, but we don't know. So, these are just some things potentially we need to think about with event-driven PrEP in the future. So that's event driven PrEP, how we're going to get more people using it, or for people who want to use it, how to get them using it correctly. But what does the introduction of this new dosing regimen, what implications does it have to PrEP implementation generally? So one of the key things that I really want people to take away from this is that a lot of the PrEP implementation, measuring, monitoring, often will assume daily dosing, and we don't even know that, that's what we do, but it's something that was built out kind of out of those initial trials. So, so PrEP monitoring with prescription data, for example, might estimate PrEP users assuming daily dosing, like current PrEP users by daily dosing. To my knowledge, in Australia, we don't do that, but I believe, I think there was a study in Germany that had to use survey data to estimate the number of event-driven PrEP users to then factor into their calculations of an estimate of current PrEP users. So just something to keep in mind. And a lot of studies might use the medication possession ratio, or MPR, as an objective measure of adherence, but that doesn't really make sense. So MPR, you would ask someone how many pills they have left, and that would kind of indicate how adherent they were in a time frame. But that assumes daily dosing, and if people are taking an event-driven, what do you do? And this is kind of an even broader issue, I think, about measuring adherence to PrEP, because unlike medications for chronic illnesses, PrEP is meant to be taken to prevent HIV relevant to some exposure. So if someone's not having sex at all, it doesn't make sense for us to think of them as non-adherent to PrEP, even if they've been prescribed it and even if they have pills in their drawer. So one way to look at this is thinking about prevention effective adherence. So that incorporates doses with periods of risk and using behavior as well as dosing to kind of calculate adherence or conceptualize adherence. So I came back to this PEP thing because I recently was looking at some guidelines that are being updated for PEP. And this issue of adherence kind of has implications for other things. So currently, if someone's non-adherent to PrEP and they've come into a clinic and they might be suitable to take the 28-day course of PEP, this is what the guidelines currently suggest. Different decisions depending on how adherent someone was to PrEP. But this assumes daily dosing. And that is something that, I've suggested, and potentially we might see a change in that. But this is just an example of how some things, that were written with daily dosing as the only way to take PrEP might need to be updated in a world where daily PrEP isn't the only way to take it. So like I said, adherence is relative to some risk exposure. So, you don't have to, if someone who isn't having sex doesn't have to adhere to PrEP, that it doesn't make sense. But we still need to figure out ways to measure adherence to PrEP to see, how protected people are. And so Ben has actually published on this. So looking at prevention effective adherence in previous EPIC New South Wales participants. And so what was done in that study was they were asked about the sex they've had in the last week, and then also about when they took PrEP in that last week. So this would be really accurate for the last week because, the memory is fresh, very short time frame, and you would know. But it won't be able to give detail on a much longer period of time. So, asking someone about something like that for 3 months is really unrealistic. You could ask them directly, have you had any condomless sex that was or wasn't covered by PrEP? And this could be really easy to add in to something like a survey, but or a medical consult, but it relies on the patient or participant's understanding of what covered means. And also, like I said, memory over a longer period of time is less reliable. So I'm posing to you, people watching this today, I want to hear your thoughts on what you think about it, what potential ideas on how to measure adherence to not just ED PrEP, but PrEP more generally to incorporate potential different dosing regimens. And I want to talk about, this terminology of being on PrEP. So here are some screenshots from Grindr and Scruff, and you can tell people on your profile, if you're taking PrEP, if you're on PrEP, but that gets a little bit confusing for someone who doesn't take it daily, where you might assume daily dosing. If I can get very personal for a minute, someone asked me if I was on PrEP, and and at the time I was taking on demand, taking Epidemiology, and I wasn't sure how to answer, the question, are you on PrEP? So, imagine a world where you could specify that you were taking event-driven PrEP, and that you would need at least 2 hours notice, because, for a lot of people who put that they're on PrEP on their profile, the other people they're chatting to might feel more confident in negotiating a condomless sex, for example. And besides the kind of that real world, on the apps, when we think about our studies as well, asking participants, are you currently taking PrEP or are you on PrEP? For event-driven PrEP users, that could be conflicting. If you have pills in your drawer, but you haven't taken them for the last 2 months, do you think of yourself as being on PrEP just because you haven't had sex in that time? Sure, if you had sex 2 days before that survey and you had taken the 2-on-1 correctly, you might be more inclined to say that you are on PrEP. But we have to think about, maybe rethink what being on PrEP means. And I also kind of want to talk about PrEP discontinuation, because it becomes less about behavior and more about intention. So rather than measuring if someone has discontinued PrEP based on if they are actually taking it, it's now more about, are they going to take it in the future if it's event-driven? And we also need to make sure that people who don't take PrEP for a long period of time, who might want to restart it, need to make sure that that they're aware of their pill's expiry date. And PrEP is a rapidly changing field. We recently got the long-acting injection, the 2-month injection, is shown to be effective at preventing HIV, and there will be more in the future. And I think that we need to think about how those emerging modalities will fit into our current PrEP infrastructure. And I think event-driven PrEP, has a space and a place in the future of PrEP. But I also think right now, it being one of the few current alternatives to daily, I'm using it as an opportunity to, reassess our PrEP infrastructure and what assumes daily dosing and so on. So I think this is a really good opportunity for PrEP uptake with the introduction of event-driven PrEP. It gets more people to use PrEP that could protect themselves from HIV because they think event-driven PrEP is suitable for them. And it also could overcome barriers to PrEP generally, like the lower costs. We don't necessarily need to get more. I think it's good to get more people a form of prevention that works for them. And this is a really radical idea, and I'm not proposing any of these in true earnest, but it's something to some potential inspiration. But we could think about really innovative and radical ways of dispensing PrEP that isn't just the bottle of pills of 30 pills. So, rather than that big bottle, what about small packages of just, a week's worth of pills to cover that discrete period of time? Imagine sex on premises venues or large social events where peers distribute a small number of pills to be used in periods where lots of sex is expected. What about vending machines? Vending machines on sex on premises venues or elsewhere. Lots of logistical issues. I'm not saying that these are necessarily desirable or optimal, but just some, imagination thinking about, potential options in the future. And like I said, I think ultimately, because ED PrEP is this alternative to daily, we get to really, identify those aspects of policy and practice that relies on daily PrEP. And we know what issues to expect when the injectables come in, when the implants and monthly pills come in. There's so many questions to still be answered, but I hope this presentation will help start a conversation about how to overcome those challenges while exploring those future opportunities for the future of PrEP beyond daily dosing. So I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people. I've already mentioned a lot of these people by name. I also want to say thank you to Andrew Gulick, who helped me with a little bit of background and also telling me about, the lack of regulation around the world, and also to a lot of the funders of the studies that have been presented today. Thank you.
Great. We've had quite a lot of conversation in the chat. So we've got 10 minutes. So I don't think we'll get through all of them. And so for that reason, I might focus less on some of the statements and more on some of the questions that were actually asked, but just to quickly sort of whip through some of them. So Martin Holt was suggesting whether we could suggest a more predictable version of ED PrEP, maybe weekend PrEP, because we do have some evidence that says maybe people have more sex on the weekends. That would certainly work, I think, for people who have that really predictable pattern of sex, that it's really only on the weekends that they have sex. And similarly, I think there's this question about whether men can anticipate when they're going to have sex or not. So if you're someone who really does plan out your sex pretty well, like say you always go to a sex on premises venue on a particular day, you can quite easily take your pills 2 hours before. So I don't know if there's much research about that. Curtis, I don't know if you've come across research about this idea of either weekend PrEP or planning with anticipating sex.
No, and I think that would have to be a lot about the pitching, I guess the messaging behind about different dosing regimens. I was having a chat with Anthony the other day, who's on the chat, about how we conceptualize these different dosing regimens, and in the end, like how different are they really? And I think to the point of planning sex, that it's really that's a really tough one. And ultimately, remembering that I keep saying that ED PrEP is good for people for who it would be suitable for, is some of those examples where they were having multiple exposures, multiple unplanned exposures. Perhaps daily PrEP is actually the better option for them, and they should consider switching from event-driven to daily. I think that a lot of the conversation at the moment is in the one direction, but remembering that if your circumstances change and you're having a lot of sex, that you should consider going back to daily as well.
Yeah, and I think Anthony's made the point in the chat that everyone can probably just agree that there are just
yeah.
very different, there's all these different versions of taking oral PrEP now, but really they're all kind of the same thing now. It's you don't have to think about them so separately anymore, because you can do various ways of having enough pills in your body to cover the particular acts of sex. And trying to get people to understand how easily you can switch back and forth, how you can sort of just take a break when you're not actually taking any pills, but as long as you're having any sex, but as long as you start up again, then it's kind of all good. And that's the prevention effective adherence paradigm that I think you've made a really good point throughout the presentation, Curtis, of a lot of our systems are set up assuming daily PrEP. And we've got to make that shift, I think, to a prevention effective adherence paradigm. Just a question from Michael Traeger in Melbourne. So we see that there is sort of this pretty consistent group of about 1/5 who say that ED PrEP is their top preference, no matter where we ask it. But then we have a much smaller, well, at least a little bit earlier, we had a smaller proportion of people using it. And so what do you think that about? Is that lack of confidence in taking it correctly, or are we actually catching up? Are we actually seeing the proportion grow enough, and maybe will it actually catch up?
Yeah, I think that could be a lot of things. The first thing I think of when I think of that gap is that if that question, if you remember, that's asking about preferences for hypothetical things. So it also includes the long-acting injection and the implant. And for a lot of people, event-driven PrEP, the idea of taking pills around the time of sex, that question might have been the first time that they've ever heard of it before. And they see that and they go, oh, that's an interesting thing I've never thought of. If I could take that, I would if I knew more about it. So I think it's a combination of a lot of things, including hypothetically taking it versus actually knowing about it, having the confidence to initiate that conversation. But like I said, a lot of the people for whom event-driven PrEP would be suitable for are those who don't have a lot of sex, who aren't already on daily PrEP, and they might be hesitant to initiate PrEP in the first place if they don't intend to take it from day one. So there are a lot of reasons. I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I think that's a really interesting kind of point that needs to be explored a little bit more.
Yeah. So we had a slightly different question from Jordan, who was saying about what proportion of those who are already using daily PrEP were in long-term relationships with HIV positive partners and had so less interest in changing. Does this sort of data exist? I mean, I would say, I think from the data we do have, Jordan, I think we would say that the vast majority, even those in relationships, are mostly taking PrEP to protect them from casual sex rather than from their partner, even if the partner's positive. And obviously, if their partner is positive, in Australia, they are very likely to be undetectable, and they can rely on you as you in that situation. So I think in most cases in Australia, we think it's probably more about the casual sex context. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Curtis, or not.
No, I'm trying to think of if there's anything about the daily and event-driven dosing strategies in relation to partners. But yeah, I think you're right. I can't think of anything. Most of the time it would be for casual sex.
So I'll just sum up a couple of points rather than questions. So Michael Whelan from Melbourne and Andrew Goulet from the Kirby have noted that, well, Michael said that while there isn't pharmaceutical approval for on-demand PrEP, for certain doctors who are using certain prescribing software, on-demand instructions actually can be generated and then printed onto the prescription, which is great because that goes to the point you said, Curtis, about if someone opens the product information, it's not going to be there. So it's great that something can be printed out there using that software. And then Andrew's made the point that pharma companies are not the only organizations that can apply for TGA approval for something. So theoretically, an organization like ASHM could also do this. And then that would mean, from a doctor's perspective, the two versions of PrEP are on equal footing. And that goes to what you were talking about in your presentation about maybe part of the problem here is that doctors don't feel confident in it because the product information sachet is very, very clear about what it's saying.
Yeah, GPs don't have a lot of time to figure out the 2-on-1 in the consult if someone presents for PrEP. And I think it's, it's also a problem to the point of not just drug companies could apply, anyone could apply, but really, I said that thing about no incentive. it takes a lot of work, right? So the admin side of like pushing for that listing to be changed. And, it would be great. I would really love to see that, but who is going to do that in the end is a bit up in the air.
And I think there is almost there's almost a research question here to sort of figure out how much is that actually impacting all of this. And that's one of the problems we have in all of this sort of in this implementation phase of PrEP rollout that we're in, is we can identify a lot of potential barriers for why certain things are not happening the way that maybe they should or could. But it's hard to gather data that tells us what's actually causing, or if there is a barrier, if there's a set of barriers, which of those barriers are accounting for the larger proportion of the problem. Because you don't want to put a whole bunch of time and resources into something that's only going to change 2% of the problem. So I think some of these are actually amenable to research questions, but it's a question of whether you would bother to do a study that would actually answer that.
Yeah, and look, I also want to shout out that from my conversations with Western Sydney Sexual Health Centre, that they do have their own kind of in-house set of resources about PrEP, including on-demand PrEP and event-driven PrEP. So it is great to see that there are a lot of places, taking that responsibility kind of in-house, but, it would be nice to see something a bit more standardized across the board.
Yeah. So we're not going to get through the rest of all of these comments because we've only got 3 minutes left, but just a point from Philip Kane about the wording of our questions. I'll probably just say, Philip, yes, we're aware that the wording of those knowledge questions, are not perfect. There's actually a couple of them. You've pointed out one, which was about how many days the person should take the pills. Obviously, as Curtis pointed out, if you have another sexual exposure, it should be 2 days after the last episode of sex. And there's also another one of those 3 questions that isn't quite perfectly worded, because we say at least 2 hours rather than 2 to 24 hours, because it's probably not good to take the loading dose 36 hours before and then have your next one after the sexual exposure. So yeah, we probably need to clean up those questions a little bit to make them a bit more effective. Joyce is just pointing out that the prevention effective adherence paradigm also needs to take into account other forms of protection. So there obviously some people still do use condoms every now and then. Some people might be relying on undetectable viral load, and there might be some other things going on like serosorting or strategic positioning and so on. So it is important to keep that in mind too.
Yeah, and Martin's concept of the net prevention coverage, I think, while that's on a big kind of population level, lessons from that can be brought into the individual level on adherence as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Catherine O'Connor has mentioned that older men who are older than 45 are much more at risk of problems with renal dysfunction associated with daily PrEP. And so should we be considering this more for older men? I would say yes, absolutely, Catherine. Curtis is nodding.
Yeah, I couldn't find any studies that necessarily said that event-driven PrEP produced less side effects, but kind of from a logical, like you take fewer pills, to me, it seems like a really attractive option for which side effects is a deterrent for people.
Yeah, and then Anthony's replied to that comment saying there has been a really recent systematic review that's just come out in the HIV Lancet HIV, and that's about kidney functioning. And so the WHO is now basically saying that really regular kidney function monitoring doesn't really even need to happen for younger men anymore. And I think that's great. It's less of an issue here, I think, in Australia, but particularly in developing countries or lower to middle income countries where it's not necessarily easy to get access to that. That anything that kind of simplify and make PrEP easier is really good. And then the last comment was just from Michael Whelan, just telling us exactly what's on the script. So it just sort of says daily or as on demand, 2+1+1 take, and it actually has the instructions of how to take it, which is fantastic to see.
That's great.
Thanks so much for letting us know about that, Michael. I didn't know about that. That's really good. So we'll leave it there. It's 2 o'clock. Thank you for everybody for coming along. Thank you so much, Curtis. I will just highlight that next week's seminar is also on PrEP. So everybody here who's got an interest in PrEP, please come along to that. It's from our colleague, Hua Chuan Zhou, who lives currently now in China, and it's going to be on PrEP rollout in China. And I think that'll be a really interesting presentation. As we know, China can often take a little bit of time to get onto the bandwagon, but when it does, it goes big. So it'll be interesting to hear from him about how that's rolling out. And then the week after that, we're actually not doing the Tuesday seminar. It's going to be on Thursday instead. And we've got 2 really fantastic international guests, Robin Wood and Linda Gale-Becker. So really make sure that you come along to that. Look out for how that is going to be on a different day in the calendar. So thanks everyone for being here today. We hope you have a great day. Cheers.
All right. Thanks.